Welcome to Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. Very excited about the duo we're talking to today, Margaret Talbot and David Talbot. They have a fantastic new book about lessons from history, and this can sound like a little cheesy. Activists throughout history in the 60s and 70s, what they brought to their movement, some of the dissensions, some of the failures, some of the successes, et cetera, et cetera. But they bring honesty, unvarnished honesty and truth-telling to it that makes it super fascinating. Very excited to talk to them. But want to start with a few things. So $15 wage has apparently become the answer, surprise, surprise, to businesses that are having trouble getting workers. Turns out, Kyle, according to the Washington Post, that when you pay people a living wage, they actually want to work for you.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm just happy that they're actually reporting that fact.
They have a couple of good, we love Jeff Stein. They have a couple of good economics reporters over at the Washington Post, I will say.
But usually, the usual, like if this was 10 years ago, I feel like they would have just buried this story.
You think so?
Because I know, like my mom, for example, watches CNBC. You know what they talk about 24/7 now? Oh my God, inflation.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Make sure the federal government doesn't spend a penny on regular people from now until the end of time. Inflation, inflation, inflation. Be afraid. And the whole point of that is to handcuff, Washington for doing anything more. So, I'm happy we're not getting wall-to-wall that elsewhere, and the fact that they're even reporting on this story makes me happy.
Yeah, so they talked to, and this wasn't just like one or two business owners. They surveyed dozens of different business owners who had been having trouble getting workers to apply to these jobs. A lot of them are restaurants. Of course, servers were extraordinarily hard hit during the coronavirus pandemic. Like, you're on the front lines, you're making low wages, all of that stuff. And so a lot of those workers have been reassessing whether they even want to be in that industry, even going to warehouse work and other lines of work. And they found that when they went from literally like zero new applications for these jobs to paying people $15 an hour and suddenly flooded with thousands. There was an ice cream shop in Pittsburgh, bunch of restaurants down in Charlotte that they talked to. And the other piece of it that was really interesting, as they said, at some places they had to somewhat increase cost, but they talked to some of these owners too who say, actually, we didn't. And in fact, now that we have workers back in and they're happier, so they're more productive, we're actually saving money and doing even better than ever.
Yeah, I read something about how Chipotle, there were these fear-mongering headlines, Chipotle raises prices after they raise wages. Guess you shouldn't raise wages. It was like 40 cents. Like 40 cents, and now somebody actually can live.
Yeah.
It's like, you sure you want to get rid of the wage slaves, buddy? Sure you want to be radical like that? Like, yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure about that. And by the way, in that article that you're referencing, I think the headline it's not just 15. Some places are paying more than 15. So it's like, they said 15 or more.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're going to get fucking, of course. Listen, if you're not paying a living wage, you can't bitch about people not wanting to work for you. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Right.
Like, what if I paid you absolute garbage dog shit? Would you come work for me? No, and go fuck yourself. And by the way, yes, you could argue that this is one of the effects of the stimulus checks, but good. Like, it's okay to say that's a good thing. It's good to give people, and even people who are checking out of the system now and taking time to reevaluate.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
This is one of those things where, like, on Fox News, they're freaking out about it, and they're like, oh my God, the workers have agency. Right. Oh my God, get them back in. It's like, I don't care. That's a good thing. It's amazing how, like, it takes so little to just bait them into be like, your whole existence should be to serve me and the market gods.
Yeah.
And make nothing.
Or Art Laffer out there, like, poor people and minorities and young people aren't worth, that's his wording,
yes,
aren't worth $15 an hour. Like, that is quiet part out loud if I've ever heard it. All that human beings are to people like Art Laffer and so many others is just like cogs to be used and abused by the market system and disposed of when you have no use for them.
Soulless economic agents. That's how he views it. And it's funny because their view is, the way I look at it is, we need a system that exists for the benefit of the people. So, like, the economy should exist in a way for the benefit of the people. They flip it. They feel like, no,
people should be there for the benefit of the market.
Yes, you need to fit into the market. Like, find some way to sort of.
Great way of thinking about it.
That's exactly what it is, and it's really fucking stupid. But it's this mind virus that has taken over this country ever since Ronald Reagan. But it's amazing how deep the rot is because they think they're like keeping it real and it's all common sense, the stuff they're saying.
Yeah. Well, let me read you. This is also sort of like the Costco model. Like that's always been their model is we're going to pay people a little better. We're going to give them decent benefits. And then that's going to be good for our business. And of course, Costco has been really successful. But this section of the article, I think, shows you how wrong the typical Art Laffer type thinking about the economy is. So one of the groups that raised wages and had tremendous success is called Fifth Street Group. It's a group of restaurants, I think in Charlotte. And they say, while the staffing costs have gone up for restaurants in Fifth Street Group, overall sales also increased by a larger proportion. Customer reviews on sites like Open Table have gone up by nearly 0.5 point too. Better service has translated to more sales and happier customers. And then I loved this quote from another one of the business owners they talked to. They say there's a shaming that happens to working class people. Nobody talks about the fact that the economy is going to fall apart when a tech guy gets $195K a year salary with a 5% raise every year, or when lawyers are making $300K. This conversation only happens when you're talking about the people who make the lowest wages. And I think as a society, that's just really insulting.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. I
Yeah.
have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact, and it's so true. It's only when you're talking about low wage workers that there's all this like hand wringing about, oh, the whole country's going to fall apart if we give people a living wage. And by the way, $15 an hour isn't even a living wage in large swaths of the country.
Yeah, and you're right. In some places, it's not. If you kept up with if you paid wages that kept up with productivity, it would be $22 an hour.
Yeah.
So those minimum wage workers are productive enough that they're putting out $22 in output in work, and they're only getting paid $15. So actually, there's an argument they're paid artificially low. So I mean, that's something to think about when they make the argument that like, oh, these people aren't worth that. Actually, you're right. They're not worth that. They're worth more.
Yes, exactly right.
And
exactly right. And remember all of this, like, our heroes, the essential workers are our
right.
heroes. Whatever.
Don't pay them 15. Stop.
Yeah. Make them get back into the marketplace for $7.25 or less if you're talking about tipped workers.
It's I can't believe they still have that exception.
Ugh.
It's like minimum wage unless you do this, in which case even lower than that.
Yeah.
Whoa, really? Well, we assume that you're going to get tips. I don't want you to assume dick.
Right.
Like, pay me up front.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
All right, let me see what you think about this one. U.S. weighs possibility, this is New York Times, weighs possibility of airstrikes if Afghan forces face crisis. The Pentagon is considering whether to intervene with warplanes or drones in the event that Kabul is in danger of falling to the Taliban, though no decisions have been made. Goes on to say the Pentagon's considering seeking authorization to carry out airstrikes to support Afghan security forces if Kabul or another major city is in danger of falling to the Taliban, potentially introducing flexibility into President Biden's plan to end the U.S. military presence in the conflict, senior officials said. Your thoughts?
So we're not getting out. That's what that means. That means there's always going to be a caveat. There's always going to be a by the way. There's always going to be the but what happened was, what I meant was, whether it's keeping the contractors there, or in this case, hey, let's keep drones there, or let's keep fighter jets there, or just in case, or whatever, that means we're not getting out. And I think that's terrible. I think we need to get out. And to make this argument of like, well, what are we going to do? We have to do it because of the thing and the thing. Last time I checked, somebody in Cleveland wasn't threatened by the Taliban in Afghanistan. There is no argument of imminent self-defense for the United States of America.
The Taliban explicitly does not have international ambition.
They're a guerrilla army. That's right. They're not a terrorist organization in the sense, I mean, they are terrorists, but they're not a terrorist organization in the sense that they have the Al-Qaeda mission or ISIS mission of global jihad.
Exactly.
Right.
They're a local militant organization with designs in that
Right.
country that do not imminently threaten us. Do we like the Taliban? Of course not. They're awful and horrific. And yes, like, the suffering is 100% real. We never went into Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban. That was not the idea.
By the way, we've been there, how long were we there for? 20 years? 2001 we went there. It's 2021.
Yeah.
So 20 years we were there. You had 20 fucking years. If you were going to defeat them, why haven't you defeated them yet? What
Right.
am I supposed to think? Year 23 is going to be a breakthrough or some shit?
That is what they want you to think. They always are like, well, just push it a little further. And this time we got a plan, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the thing they can never explain is like, okay, if your goal, if you want to articulate the goal and sell it to the American people of we're going to rid Afghanistan of the Taliban, what's your plan? What's that going to take? What's that going to look like? How many years? How many troops, et cetera, et cetera?
By the way, that's sort of bullshit. That's just really the cover story. I think some people believe it. Like some people who are partaking in the mission believe that. But the fact of the matter is there are other considerations at play. I mean, Afghanistan has trillions of dollars in mineral wealth. A lot of the stuff that's in your phone comes from Afghanistan. We don't want China. We don't want Russia. We don't want somebody else to have access to that because that's basically capital. That's wealth. You know, we are the world's sole superpower. We want to make sure it stays that way. There's also opium in Afghanistan. You know, there's also just the fact that the military-industrial complex gets incredibly rich by continuing to do war. You know, all these Raytheon contracts and Boeing and Honeywell and all this stuff. I mean, this is part of the consideration. The deep state, I know it sounds conspiratorial, but it's real. And these are the people who are there between every administration. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House, you have some people who, for a career, are in D.C. and they're part of the CIA or they're part of the Pentagon or whatever. And when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so they're always like, more war, more war, more war. And maybe they delude themselves and think like, no, we're the good guys. We're the heroes riding in to save the day. My ass cheeks are the heroes riding in to save the day. Get the fuck out of there. I mean, we have an infrastructure at home, an infrastructure system that gets a grade of C-. And we're talking about staying in Kandahar or rebuilding in Kabul. Rebuild fucking Flint, Michigan, bitch. Like, fix the water pipes, fix the lead in the water. What are you talking about? What are you doing? 25 million Americans don't have health insurance. And by the way, a lot of the ones who do have health insurance have terrible fucking health insurance, and it's just a scam. Fix that shit.
You know, I was just wondering what the angle was going to be, right? Because you knew there was going to be an angle to be like, well, I know we said we're going to get out, and we're really clear about it, but we can't quite do it exactly like we said. And first we get the news like, well, we are going to actually keep some contractors in there, of course. So the whole idea of troops and American boots on the ground being totally pulled out was, you know, is a little bit of a numbers game, right? And now we get, this is the other piece of we're still maintaining our interest in this country and we're still committing military resources to this country, which means that the sort of like strategic objective hasn't actually really changed.
That's right. Now, I'm done with serious stuff. Tell me about Dr. Fauci.
Oh, God. Okay. Okay. Washingtonian piece about like quarantine sex stuff, like how people were dating and making love and having sex and all this stuff during quarantine. The part that got everybody's eye is there's one dude who says that a woman that he was with asked if she could call him Fauci during sex. And he said that he just pretended, like just kept going and pretended that he didn't hear her. There's a lot to unpack there.
I don't know if I'm buying the story. I got to be honest with you.
You think this
it sounds like some bullshit.
It sounds like a little too perfect.
Or like somebody was joking. You know what I'm saying? Like something's off.
She could have been joking.
That can't be a real kink. I don't care who I don't care who it is. It could be the most. All right,
let me just take the other side for the sake of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've seen the signs around this town that are like, in Fauci we trust, and we love Dr. Fauci, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you've said with his face is on the sign in people's yards. Like, people went out and bought these signs and put them in their yards. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I could definitely see. And remember back when liberals were obsessing over Andrew Cuomo? And the term Cuomo-sexual was coined, true. And there were all these articles being written and women like thirsty and lusting after Andrew Cuomo. So I'm going to say it could very well be true.
So if it's real, I have an answer.
Okay.
It's the whole daddy thing.
Yes.
Yeah, it's people want a figure who they can put like full faith and trust in, somebody who's a brave, noble, strong, intelligent leader who always has all the answers.
Gonna take care of you.
Gonna take care of you, all that stuff. The only fucking problem is, obviously, Cuomo was a complete fraud, writing a book about how this is how we defeated COVID in New York City, as COVID is not defeated in New York City, and you're, hiding the numbers, and you got people, ordering people with COVID back into the nursing homes and giving everybody COVID and all these people dying. That's Cuomo. With Fauci, listen, the lionization of this guy, you got to stop. You got to stop. There's video of him early on in the pandemic, like, masks? You don't need to be wearing those, bro. And, he even admitted later on, oh, the reason why I said that is because people on the front lines, we wanted them to have the masks. We wanted the nurses and the doctors. So you're admitting you lied. You're admitting, yes, masks are a good thing, but we didn't want to tell you because we were afraid there was going to be a shortage. You could have just said we need to leave them for the nurses and the doctors. At least that would have been fucking honest. Instead, you lied about it, then you admit you lie about it, and as you're admitting you lie about it, you try to pretend like you're not admitting that you're lying about it.
Right.
The fuck is... And don't tell me that this is the guy. This is the fucking guy that everybody's looking up to. Just because... Listen, everybody, public service announcement. Just because somebody is an expert or they believe in science doesn't mean they are by definition correct about everything. You have to evaluate all the statements and everything they're saying independently on their own merits, because that's what you do if you don't have a cinder block where your head's supposed to be.
Right. But unfortunately, a lot of people do, apparently. It wasn't just the masks either. You probably remember this as well. There's still a question about what percentage of either like vaccinated or resistant.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
People, like what percent
herd
of the,
immunity.
of the country has to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. There's still a little bit, because it's like a range. Nobody knows precisely. It's 85% or whatever.
And he changed it in all the interviews, yeah.
He changed it over time. And when he got asked, like, okay, well, you said this amount here, which was relatively, it was like 60%. And now you're saying 80%. So what gives? Again, he admitted that he was massaging the numbers to tell people what he thought they could handle hearing at that point. And again, he doesn't act like that was lying. He acts like he's doing us a public service by protecting us from the reality that, oh shit, it's probably more like 90% of in order to achieve herd immunity. So it's not your job to like massage the facts or spin us in the way that you think is going to be okay for us to be able to handle. It's just your job to like tell us what you know to the best of your ability. And if it's a range, tell us it's a range, and that nobody knows for sure. That's fine. But when you have people who are held up as trusted public health officials, and then you see this type of behavior, it contributes to the horrific, cultural situation that we've had, where people have just taken it upon themselves and fed their like pandemic habits and choices through their own like tribal cultural lens, and then sort of like really got attached to whatever that tribal cultural pandemic lens was, because there was no real trusted source of information. Of course, Trump was like the worst actor in all of this. But the fact that you had someone who was held up, especially by liberals, as this like patron saint, and then gets caught in these very significant misstatements and outright lies is a real problem. Then he also was a bad actor on the COVID lab leak theory, had information early on, this was revealed in his emails, that it was in fact possible that this did come from a lab, and was saying publicly, no, pretty definitively that it hadn't come from a lab. So yeah, anyway, there are a lot of problems with Fauci as a sex symbol. Is basically what this all boils down to.
if you say I'm a scientist or I'm an expert and you say Trump is bad, they're going to put you on fucking Rushmore. They're just going to look up to you and idolize you and act like you've never done anything wrong. And people would say, hey, Kyle, take it easy a little bit, because you got to understand, nobody knew what was going on. It was a pandemic. Everybody was ignorant about it. To which my response is, yeah, say that. Say, I don't know. Right. Instead of fucking lying and then admit you're lying, but pretend like you're not admitting that you're lying. Like, just grow the fuck up. Like, yes, just tell the public what we actually know. And for a long time, that's very, very limited information. So be it.
That's okay.
So be it.
Would have been way better.
And everybody would have understood, hey, we don't know what the fuck this thing is. We don't know what's going on.
Here's the evidence on this side. Here's the evidence on that side.
And the lab leak theory one was interesting, too, because I know you experienced the same thing. The time I covered it and started taking it seriously was when it was either the former head of the CDC or the FDA. I forget which one.
I think it was CDC.
CDC. Okay. He came out and gave an interview to CNN. And Sanjay Gupta and stuff did the segment afterwards. And he says very clearly, in my expert opinion, granted I don't have all the evidence right now, but my educated opinion on this is it looks like it's from a lab. And, again, Sanjay Gupta came on after and was like, hey, this is serious. This is not some crank, fucking far right-wing YouTuber or some shit, right? And so that's when I started taking it serious. Even when I said that, a lot of people in my own audience came after me as if, like, what I'm doing is egregious. All I did was listen to the segment. I thought it sounded reasonable, and so I said, I'm agnostic, but now I lean more in this direction. I understand why people are angry about that and why they fear that that's the conclusion, because they think it's going to be used for a new Cold War, and they think it's going to be used for like militarization and whatnot. So I get why people are concerned about it, but we have to be willing to separate out the facts of what happened from the political implications. And you can say the following sentence: it's possible it came from a lab, or likely it came from a lab. And by the way, you should not use that in any way, shape, or form to do a new Cold War, to push for more militarization with China, because I got news for you. It's not like they did it on purpose. It was a fucking mistake. And the U.S. funded a lot of it. If indeed the lab thing is true, Fauci was involved.
The
Right.
U.S. was
They
funding
funded
some
it.
of that research. So.
They funded it. That's right.
Yeah, that's uncomfortable. I also just think it's fascinating, though, this like persistent yearning you saw. Then this exists on the right as well. Obviously, like Donald Trump is perfect manifestation of that desire for the daddy
Probably
figure.
worse on the right, yeah.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it probably is worse on the right. But you had this just persistent thirst for that daddy figure among a lot of, like, this, like, it's very authoritarian
100%. That's the definition of it.
type instinct. Like, just give me the guy who's going to tell me how it is and answer all the questions. I'm not going to have to worry. I'm not going to have to think about it. Like, has that take charge energy. Like, just give me that. And you saw that, too, during the the early phases of the Democratic primary, when there was a flirtation with, what was Stormy Daniels' lawyer's name? I'm really happy.
Michael Avenatti.
By
the way,
I'm glad that wasn't in my head, actually.
Pat me on I was the very first one to be like, that guy's a fraud. Again, this is one of those things where my own audience was like, yeah, but he said the thing. He said maybe he's for Medicare for all, and he's on the thing, and he bashes Trump. And I'm like, homeboy is a fraud, son. It's so easy I smell it from a mile away.
I get it. Like, I think that this instinct, it comes from the legitimate sense that things are extraordinarily unsettled, right? It's like a very chaotic, uncertain system right now. And so people drive towards that, like, authoritarian figure, and it does create a very dangerous situation. I just think it's sort of revealing with Fauci that it's not Republicans alone who are vulnerable to that instinct of just give me the daddy who's going to tell me how things are going to be.
Yeah, no, I maybe this is just I'm perceiving it more, but it certainly feels like it's gotten worse with liberals over time.
It does feel that way.
You know? But, but to be fair, though, maybe we just didn't realize it, or maybe we were even fucking part of it in the early days of Obama. Because I was definitely way more partisan back then.
I was a Hillary voter in that primary, though. Is that it? I don't know. To
be fair, to be fair to you, I was torn too.
She was better on healthcare.
Well, that's exactly right. The reason why I was torn is because she was running on single payer in 2008. People don't remember that. She was running on single payer healthcare, and Obama was not running on single payer healthcare. But the reason I ultimately voted for Obama in the primary is because just before my state voted, New York, they were like, there was this big story that blew up where Obama said, I'll negotiate with anybody without preconditions, including Iran. And Hillary was really attacking Obama for that.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's the dumbest thing. Of course I'm on Obama's side for that. And Hillary's way too hawkish. And then you think about the Iraq War, and he was against the Iraq War. So ultimately I went for Obama.
Allegedly. I mean, yeah.
He said.
He clearly, rhetorically, was much better on foreign policy than she was in that. And I said that I was a Hillary voter. The truth is, actually, I had my first daughter the day before the Democratic primary in Ohio, where I was living at the time. So technically I did not vote because I was in the hospital. I just had a baby.
So why would you say you're a Hillary supporter?
That's who I was going to
make everybody hate you?
I went to, like, rallies and stuff. I went to a Hillary rally. I went to an Obama rally as well. I went to a Bill Clinton came to town. I also went and saw for the, like,
where did he touch you?
Entertainment value of it. Boy, he was still sharp back then. Like, at that time, he still had it. Although there were some protesters that heckled him, and that, like, old man crankiness did come out.
Yeah, but Bernie rocks that well.
Bernie, it's like charming with him. Yeah. Bill, you're just like, oh, you're mean. Yeah. I also went to a Sarah Palin thing just to see what that cultural moment was like. Because when in Ohio, that was back when Democrats actually had a chance of winning Ohio. It was battleground area and battleground state. So they all came traipsing through there. So anyway.
Can't believe you were a Hillary supporter. How am I sitting? Who am I even sitting next to?
It's gross.
Of course you know I was an Obama supporter. Everybody was sort of a little bit duped by him early on, you know?
Not me. No.
You were duped by somebody worse. Way worse.
I wasn't duped. I had my eyes open. But anyway, I was duped in many other ways. Anyway, one more story to get to, which is You all probably saw the clip at this point. French President Emmanuel Macron getting slapped in the face by a dude. That dude has now been sentenced to serve 4 months in jail. Kyle Kalinske, what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I was confused about his background when we were reading about it. One of the things said he was a supporter of the Yellow Vests. If he was a supporter of the Yellow Vests, that would lead me to believe he's left-wing, and Macron is like this mushy centrist Obama for...
Neoliberal dude.
Yeah, neoliberal dude, corporatist in France. But then the more we looked into it, the more it was clear he's actually very clearly right-wing.
Yeah.
He did the French royalist or monarchy chant, and he also, they found a Hitler book at his place.
So,
right?
okay, so I gave you a little bit of misinformation there.
Okay.
Upon further reading, so there was another man who was also arrested, and he's the one who had the copy of Mein Kampf and the like other Nazi stuff. But the guy who slapped Macron, I
like the way you say that.
I heard shouting. Montjoie Saint-Denis, I think, the army's battle cry when France was still a monarchy. He said it's a patriot slogan. And he described himself as having far right-wing views. So apparently he's part of what he's described as the royalist right. Like they want France to be a monarchy again, I guess. I don't know. Some French listener needs to fill me in on all of these different distinctions and nuances. But anyway, he seems right-wing. So what do you think of, but that's sort of irrelevant to the jail term and the sentencing. So what do you think of that?
First of all, if this guy was in the U.S., he would have been shot by Secret Service on the spot. I think that's very clear.
You think so?
I do. And then I also think if he wasn't, which he would have been, but if he wasn't, he would have gotten a longer sentence because they would have booked it as assault. Or
threatening the life of the president or something.
Is that its own thing?
I think it is.
Well, either way, it would have been a lot tougher in the U.S. I actually don't know what I think of the sentence because, yes, the guy definitely shouldn't have done it. Definitely is illegal and should be illegal. But I don't know, because a slap in different contexts means so many different things, which is almost like why the whole concept of the law is difficult, because you can't treat every slap the same. If I'm playing basketball with my buddy and I piss him off or he pisses me off and he gives me a slap, even if it's somewhat aggressive, it's like, I'm not going to send you to prison for 4 months. That's fucking crazy. Granted, this is not that context. So again, the context matters, and this is not that context at all. But I don't know what I think the proper punishment is. I really don't. This one really stumps me.
So in the U.S., threatening the life of the president is a Class D felony, and it's punishable by up to 5 years in prison, a $250,000 maximum fine, a $100 special assessment, and up to 3 years of supervised release per Wikipedia.
It's tougher, yeah.
So, yeah, it is tougher. And I think they would probably hit him with something like that. Like, they would definitely throw the book at him, for sure.
Yeah, listen, it's terrible. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. But there are plenty of parents who slap their kids.
Well, and Macron was clearly not in any real danger.
We say that now in retrospect.
Yeah.
I agree with you. He wasn't in any real danger. And that's why it's I kind of grant permission people, if you want to laugh at it now, you're allowed to laugh at it.
Yeah.
But at the time, we didn't fucking know that. So I'm a much harsher judger in the moment, because it's we don't know what the fuck that guy's doing. He could have a knife on him. He could have a gun on him. He fucking slit his throat. We don't fucking know.
Yeah. It is kind of wild that he was able to get that close.
Macron walked right up to him, and he had his people around him, and he was just like...
Oh, this was another funny detail. Hold on, let me find this. Apparently, he
said Fauci's name during sex.
Yeah, that was the other part, is he had he had a Fauci tramp stamp, and so he was really into that.
Fauci-gasm.
So he had considered throwing an egg or a cream tart at the president, which strikes me as a uniquely French kind of an
cream
assault.
Tart? Fuck out of here. Give me some toaster strudel like an American.
A cream tart.
Toaster strudel's the best.
I wish he'd thrown a cream tart at him, because that would have been...
I don't even know what that is, Krystal. I know the word cream and I know the word tart. I don't know what it's like together.
Put it together and you can kind of imagine what it might be. I don't know.
Some weird-ass French shit.
Yeah, anyway. So that's all I know about that.
Anyway, I wish we had their healthcare system.
Bottom line.
We can end the story now.
Bottom line. Okay, guys, we've been working on getting this interview for a while. Very excited to talk to Margaret Talbot and her brother, David Talbot. So David's founder and former editor-in-chief of Salon. His sort of specialty is digging into what he calls hidden history. Like, he's very, very focused on American power and the cabals that have run the country.
He's the CIA's worst nightmare.
CIA's worst nightmare.
He's the CIA's worst nightmare.
So his book that actually inspired me to reach out to try to get him on is called The Devil's Chessboard, Tracks History of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who really killed JFK. We're definitely going to ask him about all of that. And he has a new book that he wrote with his sister, Margaret, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker and also an author in her own right. She wrote a book called The Entertainer, Movies, Magic, and My Father's 20th Century. So they wrote this new book, which is fascinating. You got it? By the Light of Burning Dreams. And just go through some of the really intricate, really significant history of these activist movements, and not in like a Disney way, like in a real way.
Right.
With the characters involved and what were the successes, what were the failures, etc. Very excited to speak with them. Without further ado, here are David and Margaret. Margaret and David, thank you so much for being with us. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Margaret, just tell us a little bit why you wanted to write this book at this moment.
Yeah, well, it was David's project to begin with, and he can tell you a little bit about how I ended up stepping into it. I'm his younger sister, and we're both journalists, of course, and have been writing for a long time. David was signed up to do this book and actually had a stroke. And he, as you will see, doing very well. But at the time, having done a bunch of interviews with some leading activists who, some of whom are no longer with us and some of whom are, but they were wonderful, kind of one-of-a-kind interviews. He didn't want them to go to waste. He wanted to do the book. And so he asked if I would help out. And so I stepped in to do it and was really thrilled to. I really was interested at this moment of kind of revived activism in revisiting the 1960s and 70s social movements, which were led by, as we say in the book, many flawed but visionary and bold men and women. And we wanted to see what lessons we could draw from those movements, from movements today, what inspiration and what cautionary tales as well.
So, big picture for me, what did the revolutionary movements of the 1960s and 1970s get right, and what did they get wrong?
You want to have a go at that first, David?
Yeah, I think what we were really keen on really drilling down on was not just general profiles of these various men and women, but looking at turning points, decisive moments in their lives when it really changed their own lives and the course of American history. So what did they get right? Well, Margaret and I make an argument, although we don't subscribe, as we say in the introduction, to the great man theory of history. We do believe that leadership, the right kind of leadership, is essential. And today, of course, there's an anti-leader kind of bias, and we understand it. Tragically, some of these leaders were even assassinated. So you would hear young activists on the streets in Minneapolis and Portland and other places over the last year say, we know what happens to leaders. They kill them. So there's a reason, I think that younger people are, cynical, I think, about leaders today. And of course, we know that a lot of these leaders, as you said, Krystal, it's not hagiography, our book. We look at them warts and all. And these were flawed human beings, these leaders. And yet they were visionary and courageous. Martin Luther King said it took a crazy kind of courage to do what he did. Every day his life was a danger. And of course, he was finally assassinated himself in 1968. And so number one, I think leadership is important. It's important to hold movements together. It's important to give movements a sense of direction and inspiration. And I think our book makes an argument for that. Number two, I think really important what they got right is coalition building. John Lennon and Yoko are in our one of our chapters, are the sort of the main characters. They were hanging out in Greenwich Village with the Black Panthers, with Kate Millett, the well-known feminist critic and author, with Jerry Rubin and Stu Albert and Abby Hoffman, who were yippies, and many other movement figures at the time. They were not in isolation, these people. Martin Luther King called up Bobby Seale from the Black Panthers and said, "Would you join my March on Washington, the Poor People's March in 1968? And, you know, many people thought the Panthers thought Martin Luther King was an Uncle Tom, was a sellout. But no, Bobby said he was honored to get that phone call. He told me in an interview, and he readily agreed to join Martin's March on Washington, which tragically he, of course, could not lead because he was assassinated in Memphis. So, you know, coalition building, solidarity between groups, that's another important lesson.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think also there's a perennial debate in social justice and progressive movements about, you know, working inside or outside the system. And I think you know, we think of a lot of the 60s movements as being quintessentially outside the system, out in the streets protesting, and they certainly were. But, you know, we found in both the chapters on the Panthers and the chapter on Tom Hayden and others that, you know, a lot of these leaders also sought electoral, you know, power, wanted to work through electoral politics, wanted to be inside as well. And, you know, it sounds like an obvious thing, but it's really true. You need to be working in all of these channels. And I think there was more understanding of that than we sometimes give credit to the 60s movements for having and doing. So they were building alternative institutions, doing some amazing things underground, but they were also, you know, working above ground through more mainstream institutions and electoral politics.
David, if you would dig into the piece on the Black Panthers, because one of the things that you lay out is actually sort of a tension between Seale and some of the other leadership about that coalition building piece. Just talk about some of what you uncovered.
Yeah, I mean, I was intrigued to know that there was great tensions, of course, within the Panthers over this question. The Panthers were, as an organization, explicitly not racist. They wanted to work with white radicals, with people from across the spectrum. And that was very important to the Panther ideology. And Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, all the main leaders of the Black Panther Party all shared that. And I think that was an important direction, particularly at a time when the Nation of Islam and other groups were taking a more separatist path. But there was some dissension over whether or not how mainstream they should become. Bobby Seale, as Margaret was saying earlier, thought that the Panthers had to pivot from guns, confronting you know, racist cops on the streets of Oakland with guns in a legal manner. They'd read the law, they knew what they could do as they observed police and confronted them. But Bobby thought they had to pivot away from that. That was going to, he thought, capture the imagination and the attention of the Black community, and it did, obviously, when they marched on Sacramento, the state capitol, with guns to protest a law that was directed at them and not at white militias. But he knew they had to pivot from that to electoral politics. And Bobby himself ran for mayor of Oakland in 1973. And that was very important to Bobby. Bobby said he was motivated more by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as ideologies than any foreign ideology, despite the Panther rhetoric. So I think the Panthers were headed in a very interesting, militant, and yet very mainstream in some ways direction. Unfortunately, we talked about the government repression that directed at the Panthers. They were jailed, they were beaten, they were, you know, assaulted by police. And so they were under constant pressure from the government, from police agencies. And then, of course, they had their own dissension within the organization, unfortunately. Huey Newton, was a charismatic leader, helped put the Panthers on the map, but he descended into drug addiction and criminality, to Bobby Seale's great dismay. And they had been brothers. They had started the Panthers together. And then he saw Huey, in part because of all the government and police harassment and being put in isolation in prison. It really changed, I think, Huey, that kind of treatment that he had. In any case, the Panthers because of these internal conflicts and the repression from without. We saw the movie Judas and the Black Messiah about Fred Hampton, the charismatic young Black Panther in Chicago, and how he was murdered in his bed while he was sleeping by police agents, a death squad essentially sent by the government and the FBI. So, this was in some ways enormously heroic that these people withstood this kind of constant harassment and violence from the government.
So there's a million things I want. Like, I was taking notes as you guys were talking, and I was like, I want to respond to that. I want to respond to that. I want to respond to that. I got like 50 things, but let me try to pick one of all the things. It's interesting that at the time, there was a lot of very strong disagreement within the movement, and you reminded me of young Malcolm X calling Martin Luther King Jr. a sellout and an Uncle Tom. And I was wondering if, do you see modern day parallels to that make you feel like, well, this is the problem here because we're not focusing on coalition building and instead people who generally have the same goals are sniping at each other relentlessly?
Margaret, why didn't you go?
Yeah, I mean, that is a problem that I think is kind of endemic to these movements, and unfortunately, they don't always learn from the past. But yeah, the sort of emphasis on ideological purity and on who is the pure is something that you saw a lot in the 60s and 70s, and unfortunately, you see it now, and maybe in certain ways, it's even easier to call people out and reject them because we can do it online. And, there's that kind of mob mentality you sometimes see a little bit online of ganging up on people who might, seem to be dissenting from a party line. So I do think that's always something that these movements have to worry about, that we who care about these movements have to worry about, is this kind of purging in the name of ideological purity. Because also, I think coalitions don't have to last forever. They can come together over certain issues and be very effective as long as they don't become fractious and fissured during that time. And you don't have to be, yoked to them forever. And so I think if people can think about that too, I think actually we saw that last year in a very effective and inspiring way in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer, which really were happening not only in cities but in rural areas, and bringing in young people in particular of many races and backgrounds, white, black, and many other groups represented. So I feel like there are moments when people set aside some of this purging mentality of ideological purity seeking and are able to come together around a coalition. And if they realize it can be temporary and still be effective, that's perhaps a positive lesson to learn from the past and from other successful movements.
David, take us inside some of the debates that were going on at the time about both the morality and the utility of political violence as a tactic.
Well, that was a key, of course, discussion within the Black Panther organization, as I was saying earlier, when to use guns. Bobby Seale was very definite about the use of guns only in self-defense, and never to attack people for the sake of attacking them in an offensive way, but to only use them in self-defense. People said Martin Luther King was too pacifist, and of course was following the Gandhian principles of nonviolent resistance. And yet he himself, his own home was filled with guns. Someone said it looked like an arsenal because he received so many death threats. He said he wasn't going to have his family, suffer that victimization. So Martin himself understood that you had to use guns. There's an amazing book by a SNCC. former civil rights activist in the South, called, this nonviolence will get you killed. And it was, he's quoting a Mississippi farmer. A lot of the white and black volunteers who went south, these young people, and we write about this, particularly in the chapter that Margaret wrote on the women of Jane, the Jane Collective, and Heather Booth. This was the underground abortion collective in Chicago. And Heather Booth started her sort of political career in the South as a young woman volunteering in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer Drive. And those people were under constant threat of violence from the Klan, from sheriffs who were associated with the Klan, and just armed white vigilantes. And so they realized for their own protection, they needed to arm themselves. So this became, I think, a running debate within the left, throughout the period. When do you use guns? When is it legitimate to use guns to defend yourself, and so on? And frankly, I think we're seeing that come up again today. After the George Floyd protests last year, there was a surge in gun ownership. And a lot of those people buying guns were people of color, African Americans and Latino Americans who felt threatened for good reasons. We now have a situation, unfortunately, in this country where we have white militias who are very heavily armed and white nationalists who are very heavily armed. And when to use guns, if you use guns at all, that's become a question again that I think we have to resolve.
So on that point, I actually find this discussion particularly interesting. When it comes to violence, the thing that I always thought, and I don't know how lazy this thought is, but nonetheless, it's what I thought, that, violence is only okay for self-defense reasons. But then I remember listening to something from Noam Chomsky, and he made this fascinating point where he says, actually, no. For example, if you're somebody who happens to be near a bunch of tanks that are on their way to Vietnam, where they're going to be used to kill landless peasants, if you blow up that tank and nobody else gets hurt, is that immoral? And that made me stop and go, that definitely doesn't seem immoral to me. In fact, that seems moral. So, and then of course, like you were alluding to, you get to the question of property violence after police murder an unarmed black person. And we could go on and on all day. When is violence justified and when is it not? Is it too pessimistic of me to say that, I don't know if the left is ever going to agree on this?
Well, boy,
I don't think we agree on it between us. I don't have a problem with property destruction in the same way at all. But I consider myself a very nonviolent person, and I'm wary about. I think American gun culture is such a damaging and corrosive and tragic, aspect of our society. So the idea, I understand the fears of people of color who want to arm themselves, and the concerns and what you're saying, David, about these heavily armed white supremacists. But I fear a reaction that calls for equal arming on the other side. So I know where it's coming from, but.
Yes, Margaret and I have this discussion too. I want to say, by the way, that I'm more in line with Margaret's own thinking on this myself. And I've argued with young activists who want to get guns and told them that I think that will only increase the spiral of violence in our country. I'm for democratic, peaceful action. But I do, as Margaret was saying, understand the fears and anxieties of people who feel they do need to get guns. Now, here's another question, a moral question that came up for us during the book. Bill Zimmerman, who was kind of like the Zelig of the New Left, he was everywhere. He was in the South registering voters. He was in Washington, D.C. during Nixon trying to shut down the Capitol because of the Vietnam War. He flew airplanes over Wounded Knee when the Indians there were besieged by the federal government and dropped supplies to them because they were starving because of being encircled by the federal forces. And so Bill at one point ran an organization that shipped medical aid to Vietnam during the war. And he was doing that legally, but then he did something that it would have been illegal if they'd found out. Some doctors developed a kind of penicillin that didn't need to be refrigerated, and could be used on the battlefield to help save soldiers' lives who were wounded. And he got that penicillin, this antibiotic, and took it to Paris and gave it to the North Vietnamese so they could save soldiers who were fighting against the U.S. troops. And so he saved the lives of North Vietnamese soldiers, who then later, I'm sure, a number of them killed U.S. soldiers. He could have been put on trial for treason for that. I believe that was the right thing to do. It was a moral decision that he took. And as I say, by U.S. law, he'd been branded a traitor. And yet I do think that was the correct step for him to take. So this is what's so fascinating about our book and about each chapter in our book, that each one of these people had to make a huge moral decision at some point that changed their lives and changed the course, as we say, of American history. Heather Booth, deciding as a student, a young woman in Chicago, with children at that time, to risk her own life and career by doing illegal abortions before Roe v. Wade. Margaret can talk more about that because she did extensive interviews with those women. At some point, all of these people took some heroic action that was important for the course of American history in their own lives. And that's what I say makes the book so dramatic.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
those emotional leaps that people have to take to do those too, and thinking about the impact on their own lives, their own families.
yeah, I mean, it's just such a paradox, and it's such a conundrum, and it's endlessly fascinating. And, we could think about it forever and unfortunately not move any closer to real hardcore answers. But, as you were talking, I was reminded of South Africa during apartheid. There was a lot of violence happening in the streets, and that allowed Mandela to sort of be the voice of reason and be more nonviolent. And so then you had this like good cop, bad cop dynamic that ended up working. So you think about that and you go, is the bad cop part sort of like necessary in order to get, the change that's needed? But anyway, we could go on about that forever, Krystal.
Well, I'd love to hear your reflections on that, whether that was a dynamic that you think played out during the era that you describe as the Second American Revolution. Do you think that that's, the right way of thinking about things, or is that sort of also morally bereft or factually inaccurate?
Well,
I mean, I think it is an inevitable engine of history, kind of whether it's morally right or not. I think that is the way change historically has happened, that there are groups that are willing to go out and do something more extreme, and that there are groups that are willing to say we are the reasonable alternative to them. And that is one way that social change advances. And you can, sort of debate the individual steps that the people on the extreme end took. And, it's sort of a case by case thing. But that is, I think, a mechanism that change happens by.
Yeah.
But let's talk about, again, another specific from the book, Wounded Knee, the American Indian Movement stand in 1973. They had guns there. They decided they needed, it was a motley collection of guns, but they were surrounded by overwhelming firepower from Nixon's federal forces, from vigilantes who wanted to kill them, from guys, it was militarized police presence. And it didn't begin Standing Rock or other occupations or protests that we know about today. It started years ago, this kind of militarized response to peaceful protest. So there were some 200 Native warriors and children and women and older people who occupied Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, in 1973. And as I say, they were immediately surrounded. It was a protest, but a peaceful protest, at the site of a massacre that had occurred in 1890 of the Lakota, of some 300 American Indians by the troops from George Custer's regiment. And this was a peaceful protest, but immediately they escalated the federal forces under Nixon's command. And 2 Indians were killed because they sustained 500 rounds of incoming firepower from these government troops. Amazingly, only 2 Indians were killed. But I interviewed a guy who was head of security there, Don Cuny, and he said the fact that they had a few rifles and one assault rifle was enough to hold off them from invading the camp and killing everybody. They felt another massacre would have occurred. So he made the argument they should have done the same thing at Standing Rock. Now, Dennis Banks, who was leader of the American Indian movement, was at both Wounded Knee and Standing Rock. I interviewed Dennis before he died in 2017. And he told the warriors at Standing Rock that he supported their peaceful strategy, that they confronted their own militarized police who were attacking them with rubber bullets, with tear gas, with clubs, only with prayer. They never fought back violently. And so Dennis, by that point in his life, felt that that was the right strategy. Even Russell Means, his partner, who also co-founder of the American Indian Movement, Russell was known as the militant guy, the tough guy. And he, in his autobiography before he died, said that peaceful protest was the only way. So that's what I've come to believe. I think that Dennis and Russell made the right decision ultimately. Even the few guns they had at Wounded Knee were not allowed at Standing Rock. There were no weapons allowed in that camp. I was there. I went with my son, and I would stay there for a few days. And it was explicitly and very strongly peaceful, despite, as I say, this kind of militarized response they were getting. And I believe that that's what Martin Luther King, he knew that there was going to be violence directed at them. He risked his own life every day of his life. He was attacked during marches in Chicago and Selma and so on. They were bloodied, often the protesters. He knew he was putting even children in Birmingham in harm's way by calling them out onto the streets. But he thought that that violence would somehow purge the American soul and lead to our salvation as a country. And unfortunately, I think the only way that is true, that America moves forward, is through bloodshed often.
Yeah, I think that
true.
people putting their bodies on the line is unfortunately, as you say, something that moves history forward. But that moral fortitude of resisting nonviolently is what is a form of strength, and it is what creates lasting respect and respect for those movements and ability for those movements to inspire future generations.
Yeah, well, the issue is, of course, the game is always, anytime there's a movement that gains traction for change, is to demonize that movement. And so when you introduce violence to situation, it becomes very easy to demonize. And I believe that even with, there was some actual violence, mostly property destruction, though, in the George Floyd protest. And I think the right wing used that. And by the way, a lot of, corporate Democrats, in my opinion, have used some of that as well to try to discredit not just the movement, but the goals and the objectives of that movement as well. David, I'd love for you to reflect on some of the specific examples of bad decision making, things that went awry, notable failures that you uncovered in your book as well, because those are just as important to learn from.
Sure. Well, as I say, I think it's very hard to be in a leadership position, to be under that kind of constant pressure from police and government agencies. A lot of these movements, even the most disciplined ones, were torn apart by infiltrators from the FBI and police agencies who were set into these organizations to sow paranoia and fear and distrust among members, and often resulted in people being killed, innocent people. That was the case in the American Indian movement, tragically. A young woman who was an activist was set up and by the FBI, and they convinced members of the American Indian movement she was a spy and an informer. And indeed, AIM was infiltrated by thousands of police agents and informers. And suspicion fell unfairly on her. Anime Akwash was her name. And she was found dead with a bullet in the back of her head. I think some low-level AIM warriors were arrested later and ultimately put on trial, but they never really figured out who ordered it, who the top people were. And so this was I think organizations sometimes did buckle under the pressure from the FBI. The counterintelligence program that J. Edgar Hoover, who was the notorious head of the FBI, launched against the left and left-wing organizations. And sometimes I think these groups did fall prey to paranoia, to distrust, and to violence, and eliminated members of their own organization in a tragic way. And I think that was one example of that.
Yeah, and
So,
I think also. Oh,
go ahead, Margaret. Sorry.
No, I was going to say another example is in our chapter, which was actually written by my husband, Arthur Allen, who's a journalist, about Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez used this technique of fasting as a form of protest and organization, where he would go on these lengthy hunger strikes himself, and it was very effective in terms of drawing attention to the movement and to his willingness to make these tremendous personal sacrifices. But he became, rather towards the end of his leadership of the UFW, rather paranoid, and kind of that paranoia was fueled a lot by this sort of martyrdom complex that he developed partly through the tactic of fasting. And he became more isolated. He became more he got involved in some sort of cult-related community building exercises that were very damaging to the movement. So and as David says, this is often kind of a response, a paranoid response to very real infiltration and harassment. But it is certainly something to guard against in future movements.
Tell me a little bit about Craig Rodwell and the gay pride movement.
Yeah, Craig Rodwell is one of the sort of lesser known characters in our book. A lot of people in the book, John Lennon and Yoko Ono and Tom Hayden and Cesar Chavez and the Black Panthers are much better known. He was a guy, though, who did something very interesting. He opened the first gay bookstore in the world. It was in New York in the late 60s. And it was called the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop. And he really wanted it to be a community center. He'd actually been raised as a Christian Scientist in Chicago, and he liked the old model of the Christian Science reading room, where people would sort of gather in a bookstore and talk and organize and read and think together. And so he wanted his bookstore to be that way, and it became this kind of locus of activity. But beyond that, what he did that was quite interesting is he was present at the Stonewall riots, Stonewall uprising, let's say, when the patrons of the Stonewall bar refused to go along with the raid by the police that was aimed at them simply because they were gay and lesbian and trans people. And he saw that as an important turning point. So there had been these kind of uprisings before at bars and restaurants where LGBTQ people congregated, but he saw this as a real moment to commemorate, to frame as a turning point. And so he was kind of instrumental, spearheaded the first, what became the Pride Parade, but the first commemoration of the Stonewall uprising, which was a big march in New York a year after the original night of Stonewall. And that really just was a huge turning point in the visibility of the gay movement. So he was an interesting guy in that his leadership kind of consisted of seeing the historic importance of something that not everybody grasped at the time.
That's really interesting that he saw how to turn this into a focus of attention and a kind of a turning point in the battle. When you look back on these things, you feel like they were just inevitable. Like, of course, everyone was going to see it that way, but he had the vision to say, no, this is the one we can hold up and really use to make a change. David, as you were talking about the FBI infiltration and the way that really tore a lot of these movements apart, as you were watching the Black Lives Matter protests unfold over the summer, were you seeing any echoes of the sort of tactics that were deployed in the 60s and 70s? Do you think that the FBI has reformed and changed their ways? What do you see there?
No, I'm afraid not. I distrust the FBI today as much as I do under J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI is set up to, I think, surveil and harass, protest movements. Now, finally, the white militia groups that should be, I think, surveilled and should be brought to justice, I think, are getting some attention because the Biden administration is directing the FBI to do that. But I think I tell my own sons, I tell young people around in the streets, unfortunately, for medical reasons, I can't be in the streets anymore like I used to. But, you should, have a healthy suspicion that anyone who's standing next to you throwing rocks or doing something violent, they could be provocateurs. That's how the police and the FBI operate. They often do infiltrate movements. They still do today. And so you have to be suspicious that every third or fourth person is a police agent, unfortunately, on the street with you. Now, that said, when you talk about the torching and trashing of the police headquarters in Minneapolis, I do think that, as we were saying earlier, the destruction of property in that case, I think immediately after the police killing of George Floyd was completely understandable and something that I could even support and frankly see that myself doing. I was a young militant and I did some violent things on the streets when I was protesting the war in Vietnam. And I went to jail for blocking a draft board. Which, some people would say is a criminal, even violent action. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the militant actions that I took and my brothers and sisters and others took. This book, in some ways, grew out of my own kind of feeling of solidarity for those times. And for me as a youthful activist, I don't want to, as so many other people ever grow out of those feelings of outrage. And I think I see so many young people today, including my own sons, including Margaret's kids. And we dedicate the book, by the way, to our 4 children who feel that same sense of outrage about the future that's being denied them. I'm in some ways more outraged today than I was back when I was in my 20s. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to this resurgent armed white sort of nationalist movement that we talked about, when we talk about Republican kind of sabotage in Washington, how you can't get anything through the Senate under
suppression of voting rights.
Yeah, suppression of voting rights, reproductive rights, all the battles we still have to fight. When you go back and read the Black Panthers 10-point platform that Huey Newton and Bobby Seale wrote over 50 years ago, it's both inspiring and dismaying because of how far short still we fall into their goals. An end to police violence in the community. That was one of their points of their 10-point platform, 20-point platform. An end to Jim Crow justice and the mass incarceration of Black Americans. They called for that. Reparations for slavery, equal access to housing, good housing, employment, and so on, education. These are still things that we're fighting for in this country over 50 years later. So I understand young people's sense of frustration and anger, and I feel it myself.
So to contradict myself from earlier, I brought up the apartheid South Africa situation and how there was like the good cop, bad cop thing going on, and that helped lead to change. But to contradict myself, there was also a study that came out relatively recently. This academic researcher looked into the civil rights movement, and he found that the pacifism and the nonviolence of the civil rights movement worked. And the reason why was that when sort of apolitical, moderate white Americans saw the racist Alabama police beating the hell out of innocent Black people who were being peaceful, that's when public opinion shifted. And so you brought up the torching of the police station there, and it reminded me that in that exact time frame, that's when support for BLM went from like 80% or something, and it plummeted down to like whatever it is, really low. It was like around 30 or something like that. So how do you respond to that? Because I understand that, in the moment, it feels like just to do something like that. But if the long-term consequences are like complete, the public turns on it, and that actually is not good in the long run? How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think it matters what lefty writers like me, old white guys, are going to tell people on the streets, frankly. I think no matter what I write, I'm not influencing people who are furious about one more police killing, at one after the next. Even during the George Floyd, the trial of Chauvin, the cop who killed Floyd. I mean, there was another police killing and one after that. So, I mean, it just the systemic violence of the police against people who protest, against people of color is just outrageous, and has become now, I think, a focus of so much anger for legitimate reasons. So no matter what I say about, don't torch this building in a scolding way. I mean, frankly, it's going to happen, and it should happen as long as I think police are going to keep killing Black people. I'm sorry, but that's the way I do feel. Now, look, as in terms of the civil rights movement, again, let's not sugarcoat it. People should read this book by Charles Cobb that I mentioned earlier. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed. It was a quote from a older Black Mississippi farmer who was heavily armed, had shotguns. And a lot of these farmers in the South had guns. And the white kids who went down there, like Heather Booth, who we profile in the book, did so and were protected by Black people with guns. And they knew they couldn't come in and kill everyone because Black people had guns. We saw what happened in Tulsa. An entire community wiped out through white vigilante violence. And that kind of violence was stopped in some cases by Black people who are heavily armed. Robert Williams, who wrote a book called Negroes with Guns, was head of the NAACP in North Carolina. And at one point they came to lynch one of the Black civil rights leaders in that community. And they knew they were coming. The Klan was coming with guns. And so a number of Black people who were World War II veterans, by the way, and knew how to use guns, armed themselves and drove them away without killing anybody, but through firing their weapons at them. That's what it took, unfortunately. Even the so-called peaceful civil rights movement was armed. And so this is a ugly reality of American life. As H. Rap Brown said, violence is American as cherry pie.
Margaret, reflect on, so this period, the 60s and 70s, you all describe it as such, and others have as well, as a second American Revolution. What do you think were the biggest wins of that era and the biggest shortcomings? I was actually thinking about when we were talking about Stonewall, with Pride, you have all these corporations, saw Raytheon put up their rainbow flag, et cetera, et cetera. And so some of these things, in a way, that's a sign of progress, that even the most sort of status quo symbols of American imperial power can adopt at least the rhetoric and some of the policy around inclusivity, but it also shows how far we have to go in terms of transforming America. I was wondering if you could reflect on some of that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Raytheon thing. My 21-year-old gay daughter really hates Raytheon's support of her people. But I mean, look, I do think that the gay rights movement, the expansion of our notions of sexual and gender identity are real palpable accomplishments that make people's lives better because they have an opportunity to be true to themselves in a way that they and in a public way that they did not before these movements. And so that I think that's one of the great accomplishments. And as the parent of a lesbian daughter, I feel that all the time. And feminism, the women's liberation movement. I think, we are living in to a great extent, we're living in the world that it created. We have a lot of battles that are strangely still being fought, particularly and astonishingly to me over abortion and even contraception. But in terms of women's access to the public sphere and general autonomy in many other ways, I think, in my lifetime, that has changed so much. And so much of that was the result of of the feminist movement. And so I think in some ways those are two of the biggest lasting changes of the 60s. I mean, you know, the discovery of the environment as a sphere for political organizing is obviously key. Of course, the civil rights movement and all of its repercussions. And in some ways, the civil rights movement was, you know, the crucible of all of this. I mean, all of these, so many of the people that we wrote about in all of the movements, and the farm workers movement and the gay rights movement and feminism, you know, cut their teeth, learn to feel comfortable defying the law, learn to organize through the civil rights movement. You know, white organizers as an activist as well as Black. So, you know, obviously, you know, we're we're still struggling over all the things we've been talking about, and even arguing as a country over, you know, what we can say about slavery, what truths we can tell about slavery in classrooms and so on. But we've you know, we are also living in the world that the civil rights movement is still resounding in. So so I mean, I feel like I don't want to, as David was saying earlier, I don't want to sugarcoat anything, but I think the accomplishments of this movement are of that social justice movement that we write about are real, and worth you know, celebrating.
All right, David, I want to ask you some about Devil's Chessboard, which everybody should read, must read, absolutely eye-opening, about history of the CIA, Allen Dulles, as I think we would have to argue one of the greatest villains in American history, and what really happened in the assassination of JFK. But if you could, David, just lay out for us a little bit of that history of the CIA and Allen Dulles' role and what that agency has been all about, which is a gigantic question, but I trust in your ability to break it down in the relevant pieces.
Yeah, well, in some ways, it's the flip side of our current book. I've been obsessed with understanding American power for most of my life as a journalist. And this book, in some ways, I put everything I had learned and all the research I'd accrued over the years into this book. It was a book trying to understand what went wrong with our country. Not just about Allen Dulles, as head of the CIA during the Cold War, and really the most formative figure in American intelligence, but really the people that he represented, which on Wall Street, where he came from as a lawyer, and in the military-industrial complex, where he had so many close associates. Why America became so committed to a path of violence, overthrowing foreign governments, killing foreign leaders, and so on, to impose its imperial will, as you were saying, on the rest of the world. And so the Devil's Chessboard attempts to understand that and tell that story in as compelling a way as I could, because I have a saying: when it comes to these competing views of history, the best story will win. And so I think my book does offer one very compelling narrative about what went wrong with America and how we went to the dark side. Now, there were, like Game of Thrones, other dynasties who were opposed to the Dulles dynasty. And of course, it wasn't just Allen. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was head of the State Department under Eisenhower. In many ways, the Eisenhower presidency outsourced everything to the Dulles brothers, when overseas at least. But there were these dynasties that were opposed, just like the Game of Thrones, the FDR, the Roosevelt dynasty. And that one was really winning at the time, until, of course, tragically, FDR died in the final days of World War II. The Kennedy dynasty, you know, Dulles dynasty was aligned with the Rockefeller brothers, financially and politically, which gave them a lot of clout too. So I see America as kind of, you know, it's a battle for the American soul between these competing factions, between these competing power groups within American society during the Cold War years that I focused on. And unfortunately, the bad guys won. And I think it's the best story that has not been told, because we'll never get the story on PBS. We'll never get the story from Ken Burns. We'll never get the story from the kind of establishment historians. But yet, I think that's why my book has become, despite the fact, by the way, that the Washington Post and the New York Times refused to even review my book, to acknowledge it, for political reasons. My publicist was told by the Washington Post book editor, we're not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. And the reason why, I think partly is because the corporate media was part of the U.S. intelligence and U.S. national security operation. The heads of those media companies, at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Newsweek, Time, CBS, all down the line, were very close on personal terms with Allen Dulles and other national security chiefs. They dined with them. They went to the same parties. Their kids went to the same colleges. They're all part of what C. Wright Mills, the great sociologist, later called the power elite. So there's a reason why, that even today on MSNBC, you see one talking head after the next, people from the FBI, from various national security agencies. It's a parade of people who all have the same perspective on U.S. power and the rest of the world. And where are the dissenting voices? These are the liberal channels, supposedly. Where is Noam Chomsky and others like him? So my book did not get reviewed, and yet it was a bestseller. It was a New York Times bestseller, despite the fact that it was, I think, dropped down a black hole by the media. And I'm very proud of that.
So let's not sugarcoat it. Did Dulles kill JFK?
Yes. Yes, in a word. It took me 600 pages to make the case in Devil's Chessboard, but that's what I essentially said. Now, it wasn't Allen Dulles operating on his own. He didn't operate that way. But I think a decision was made within the power elite, as I say, that Kennedy had to go because Kennedy was breaking the Cold War consensus. He was worried to death, as the brother Ted Kennedy, his speechwriter Ted Sorensen, and others told me. His main fear, the main reason he ran for president, he said, was because he thought there would be, as a student of history, JFK, that there would be an accidental nuclear war. And of course, there almost was during his watch, during the October missile crisis over Cuba in 1962. And if there had been a President Nixon instead of a President Kennedy, we might have had a nuclear war. I remember my dad coming home, and Margaret's maybe too young to remember this. She was very young at the time. I think you were only 1 year old, Margaret. But my dad coming home in 1962 and saying, well, kids, that might be it. We might not survive another day because there was a nuclear war going to happen over Cuba. And so that's how dangerous and fraught I think the Cold War was. And I think Kennedy knew that and was trying to, I think, lead a path away from that kind of brinksmanship that the Dulles brothers stood for. He had back channels to Moscow, to Premier Khrushchev in Russia, and to Fidel Castro in Cuba. The CIA was aware of this, thought that Kennedy was basically a traitor. He delivered a so-called peace speech at American University in the spring of 1963. And Robert McNamara, former defense secretary, told me that every American today should read the speech, the peace speech. And in the speech, Kennedy talks about Russians, who are supposed to be our mortal enemy, as fellow human beings on the planet. We all breathe the same air, he said. We all cherish our children's lives. And none of us wanted to go to nuclear war. That's what he said in this peace speech. So he was seen, I think, as a real maverick by these people who were in charge for national security. They felt that he was off the reservation, that he was a threat to American security, and he had to go. And I think that's what happened to President Kennedy.
Some of the pushback is, well, Kennedy wasn't actually that radical. He hadn't actually done anything that significant yet. Sure, he said he was going to, whatever his quote was, smash the CIA into a million pieces, but he'd mostly left the existing power structure in place. Just lay out some of the evidence that you find that Allen Dulles and other CIA operatives were involved.
Well, he decapitated the CIA. He not only fired Allen Dulles, he fired his top aides. He didn't go deep enough, that's true. And Allen Dulles promptly went home to Georgetown, where he lived, and continued as if he were still CIA chief. It's amazing, I think, amazingly traitorous act. The guy who Kennedy installed the CIA, John McCone, was basically a Republican businessman who knew nothing about the true CIA network and never was really in charge of that agency. I think Allen Dulles continued to run it with the help of James Angleton and Richard Helms, who were, of course, two top deputies at the agency. And they reported to him as if he still were a CIA director. Kennedy was not a Cold Warrior. No, I think that's disinformation. And I think that has become sort of an accepted line within establishment history, and it's very wrong. And in fact, because of my book, I think, and some other revisionist histories, even some mainstream historians like Robert Dallek have come around to our point of view. The Kennedy presidency was at war with itself. It fractured over the Cold War. There's no doubt, if you read the documents, if you go back, as I did, I interviewed over 250 former Kennedy officials from Robert McNamara on down, and members of the family and so on. And they all knew this. The Kennedy presidency fractured, and it fractured over the Cold War. As I said, President Kennedy was trying to pursue détente with the Soviet Union and with Cuba, and the CIA, the Defense Department, thought this was traitorous. The top generals, the Joint Chiefs, the CIA felt that when you see their unexpurgated interviews, oral histories of these men, they hated Kennedy. They hated him with a purple passion. Dan Ellsberg, who was a young consultant in the Pentagon at the time, later, of course, was the great hero, Pentagon Papers, a whistleblower. Dan Ellsberg told me that the feeling within the Air Force, where he was consulting at the time, against Kennedy, particularly after he peacefully resolved the October missile crisis in 1962 around Cuba, was again traitorous. Just again a purple hatred for him. So the idea that somehow the Kennedy was a Cold Warrior and was just another hawk like the others is completely wrong. And I have to say, it's that view is held by some people I have great respect for, like Noam Chomsky, by the way. Some left historians misread Kennedy as well. But I've done the research, they haven't. I spent years studying this, the documents, interviewing people who were there, who made that policy. And I know for a fact that my point of view on this is the correct one.
I guess my question is, how deep does the rot go? Like, we're just discussing the CIA and the FBI, CIA overthrowing small d democratic governments all over the world, FBI infiltrating and surveilling all of these activist movements. How deep does the rot go? Is this their primary function? So in other words, is like the whole deep state idea kind of true?
I feel like, where I see the rot, if you want to call it that, or the obstructions to kind of American democracy being as truly democratic as it can be right now is in the Republican Party's campaign against voter access, against voting, which is the essence of our democracy. I give so much credit to Stacey Abrams for and the many other people who are organizing around this issue. And to me, that shows such an open contempt for this basic right, this basic building block of our democracy. So I feel like that's where a lot of my strongest feelings around potential rot of American democracy are focused right now. But David has a historical perspective on it that may be a little different.
Yeah, David, what do you think?
Well, I go back to ancient Greece. That's pretty historical. In fact, I did a lot of reading about Greece as I was working on the Devil's Chessboard. I think democracy as an institution has always been very fragile, no matter what society, no matter what period of time we're looking at. From ancient Greece on, when there were militarists, there were authoritarian types, there were oligarchs who always wanted to suppress democracy. And of course, we know democracy was only for men and free men, not slaves. In ancient Greece as well. So there's always been a battle to extend voting rights. And as Margaret said today, that's still a battle. And the Republicans, and I think the corporate interests behind the Republicans, are still trying to deny full democracy, and we'll always be fighting it. And our children will always have to fight for it, unfortunately. Now, in terms of a deep state, I do think that's one element that tries to suppress democracy historically within the US. But as I was saying, there's no way to talk about a deep state anymore. It fragmented, if there ever was a deep state, and I think there was a power lead or a deep state, whatever you want to call it, that's been operating in America historically. But after 9/11 particularly, it metastasized wildly. Many different agencies, thousands of different people with security clearances throughout America. It's no longer, I think the monolith might have been under Alan Dulles. In fact, one faction of the deep state opposed Donald Trump during his presidency, tried to bring him down. And I think lefties like us were cheering them on, that part of the deep state, while another deep part of the deep state supported him because essentially he was giving carte blanche to the CIA and the Pentagon to let them do whatever they wanted around the world. So, I think it's an ongoing question whether the deep state, there is such a thing as one deep state. I don't believe it is monolithic. I believe, as I say, it's a number of fragmented power centers now. And to what extent they're lined up and to support American democracy, and to what extent they're an enemy of American democracy. I think that's an ongoing question.
Yeah, and David, finally, you're, part of the media. You've been an incredible journalist, founded Salon. How dangerous is it that some of these deep state actors they've been elevated by quote unquote liberal networks. They've become celebrated within a lot of liberal circles. What have you made of that development?
Yeah, when I started Salon, I thought, there'd be 1,000 different salons, independent media outlets that had professional newsrooms. And now I see us as more of a kind of an anomaly. The inmates were running the asylum for years at Salon. The corporate people, our investors, the suits, they didn't know what to make of us. And they thought the World Wide Web was some kind of international tennis tournament at the time. So we got in early enough, I think, where we really kind of reinvented journalism. And for about 10 years, we had the run of really the place. Amazon tried to buy us, the New York Times tried to buy us, Time Warner tried to buy us, but we stayed independent. And we thought, as I said, that there would be 1,000 flowers like us blooming in the garden of the media world. But the corporate media moved in pretty quickly to colonize digital media. And today, as you say, Krystal, every day is a different parade of the same sort of talking heads on MSNBC and CNN and so forth. The diversity, I think, of opinion and news in this country, everyone keeps, celebrating and saying, oh, it's amazing how full it is actually pretty narrow still. And the number of voices like ours, frankly, that get, on TV is still, I think, frustratingly limited. So thank God for your shows like your own, the two of you. Thank you for having us on. And, I think America needs to have as wide a range of opinion and news as possible. And we're siloed for the most part within our small sort of, echo chambers. And I think that's not for the good of American democracy.
Completely agree with all of that. Although encouragingly, some of those independent spaces have been growing as of late. So great to have both of you. Super grateful. The book is By the Light of Burning Dreams, right there. Kyle's got it for you.
Everybody check it out for sure.
The book on the CIA and Alan Dulles is The Devil's Chessboard. Both are must reads. Appreciate you both so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Our pleasure.
So that was awesome. I just want to remind everybody real quick. So we have the book By the Light of Burning Dreams. I know that sounds like a soap opera-y title. Seriously, it sounds like some shit. Yeah, it does. But I just want to let everybody know it's actually a great book, and it's about left-wing movements and the history and what everybody's approach was, what their tactics were.
Yeah.
And so it's actually really great, and the title does it a disservice, in my opinion. They could have been titled something else, in which case I think they would have sold a hell of a lot more. But everybody definitely check this book out. And the other one that we were talking about at the end there a little bit is The Devil's Chessboard,
Yes.
which is about the CIA, history of the CIA, Allen Dulles. I mean, this is a guy who not only did he potentially kill JFK, but he also was in bed with the Nazis. And, they viewed the Soviet Union and communism as a greater threat.
Yeah.
So just terrible across the board. Anyway,
The book,
sorry, go ahead.
Devil's Chessboard, is like, look, I already hated the CIA, and I already knew some of the history.
Right.
But reading this book, I'm like, holy shit, it's way worse. It's way more evil than even I thought before I went into it.
Let me just say real quick. So I've always cared just as much about foreign policy as I have about domestic economic policy, because one of the main intellectual influence on me was Noam Chomsky.
Right.
And Noam Chomsky's big on foreign policy. So I always cared about it deeply. And the Iraq War, of course, got me involved in politics more or less. But I got the sense that you definitely cared more about the economic stuff. But when you read this book, you then turned around and we were talking about it, and I was like, oh, she now cares just as much about foreign policy.
It's
because you didn't you didn't realize the extent of it's all nefarious.
Well, it's just like I said, even
Evil.
more evil. And you talk about a nefarious cabal.
Right.
It's literally the case.
Don't say that word or else you believe in QAnon.
Right now I'm Q curious.
Yeah.
I got accused of that. Very silly.
For using the word cabal.
The literal definition of cabal is what Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who are both still lionized by many in this town.
The
Dulles Airport,
Dulles
named
Airport.
for John Foster Dulles, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, David says that the Eisenhower administration basically outsourced the entire administration of these two brothers. And I don't think that that's an overstatement. And he even realized at the end that he had created and enabled a completely rogue agency that was doing things that he didn't sanction, that he didn't know about, that he didn't want done.
Right.
And that all continued. And like you were saying, Allen Dulles and the others in his general sort of sphere of influence and who shared this way of looking at the world, look, for them, fascism, Nazis, this wasn't a real threat to business interests. So this wasn't really a problem for them. They were happy to they would always downplay, and you can see in the reporting of the New York Times even at the time, they would parrot this line as well. They'd downplay the threat of Hitler, downplay what was happening there until there was just absolutely no denying. And even before the war had ended, Allen Dulles is saying essentially we know that the real enemy is the Soviet Union. Why? Well, just follow the money, right? Because communism and nationalizing industries and these sorts of things are an actual threat to business interests. And so that's what undergirds the entire Cold War mentality. And then David tracks when JFK is elected and there's just this, absolute conflict between the Dulleses and that way of thinking about the Cold War and the business interests and all of that, and JFK, who realizes that the CIA is just doing whatever the hell they want to do, things that he doesn't want them, actions that he doesn't want them to take. And so that's sort of the motive that leads to what he argues is the murder and assassination of JFK. So
right, juicy stuff. Everybody needs to check
very,
out Devil's
very
Chessboard.
juicy stuff, and also fascinating to hear him talk about the way the media was like, nope, not going to review it, not going to talk about it, we're not going to touch it with the 10-foot pole, and then it still becomes a New York Times bestseller, which is an amazing
it's
commentary.
Funny. I think that the media angle of this is interesting because I think probably in the past there was a very overt connection where you had literal CIA people planted in the media, but now I actually think it's more like a cult of thought, where they only hire the people who are sufficiently deferential to the FBI and the CIA, and they view them as legitimate institutions with honorable people. And so you don't even necessarily need, they might still have some CIA or FBI plants in the news agencies, but you don't even really need it because it's just they only hire the suckers who are going to parrot whatever they say anyway. You know what I mean?
It works just like all other parts of journalism. Reporters rise through the ranks based on, the access that they have to these powerful figures. So that the more willing you are to just sort of serve as a stenographer for the
That's right.
CIA or the FBI, the more they're going to come to you and the more you rise up the ranks. So it doesn't operate any differently than any other part of journalism. It just sometimes is even more blatant. I mean, how many stories over the past 4 years that we were told multiple anonymous sources and all of these news agencies report it as if it's fact, and then maybe a month later we find out like, that was you were being totally lied to, and this is just complete bullshit. But nobody ever pays a price for that.
That's right. Oh, you get promoted. You get promoted.
You do pay a price for not having those sources and not having that access. So that's how you end up with all of these people who are just stenographers to power, and why it's so unusual to have people like Ken Klippenstein, for example, who actually breaks news from the rank and file members of these agencies oftentimes who leak to him, and he doesn't just sort of like serve as a stenographer to power. So anyway, fascinating book. David's fascinating. Margaret's interesting too. I mean, it was kind of interesting to watch their dynamic because he's like an unreconstructed radical, right? Was talking about the militant actions that he took,
yeah, he lost me a little bit on the police station thing because that's a little too far, and that definitely was one of the reasons why support for BLM tanked.
I don't know that I agree with you on that, because do you remember at the time, I think you covered this poll too, a majority of Americans supported that action. That was very early. I promise you. Look it up. Promise you. When that
majority
happened,
of Americans supported burning down a police station?
Yes, I 100% I promise you. At that time, because that was at the very beginning, and the emotions were so incredibly raw. And I remember looking at that poll and being like, holy shit, this is not what I expected to come out of it.
Yeah, but what happened soon thereafter?
But as it continued, then, of course, the right-wing backlash comes in. So I don't know.
No, it's not. Hold on. Yeah. It's not just the right-wing backlash. You have to give some agency to the actual movements, and if their support tanked, it's also on them.
Yeah.
It's not just endless Fox News bashing. It's also they're not doing a good enough job of making their case if their shit goes from like 80% to 30%.
Sure, but these things go hand in glove, right? Like they gave the ammunition to the conservative media and to politicians who don't want to see any change happen ultimately to sort of discredit this move. I mean, it really is. It's sad, and you look at the New York City mayoral race right now as an example. It's like, we had this largest protest movement in history, and now you're about to elect probably, a very moderate candidate, right-wing candidate, you might even say, an Eric Adams, who's aggressively in favor of more policing, sort of like going backwards on those issues.
I think we have a disagreement on this because I definitely blame the left candidates for that, without a doubt. It's their fucking fault. Because they're out there, you got people who are part of these campaigns who are like, defund the police at a time when there's historic crime spiking in New York City. That's just fucking stupid. Of course people aren't going to vote for you in the middle if you say that in the middle of a historic crime spike. You're not actually addressing what the people want. You can be in favor of all the fucking police reforms in the world. I am in favor of them. But you have to have enough common sense to realize in the middle of a crime spike, you can't go out there and argue for defunding the police.
Yeah. The left has to have some answer that makes sense to people about rising crime, or else, I mean...
And they don't. And they don't. And you saw what happened with, what's her name, the one whose campaign totally imploded, and
Diane Morales.
Staffers trying to unionize like 3 minutes before the election. And
well, and this is the other, I mean, that whole thing was just a total mess. But it's very sad to see that after the largest protest movement in history, there have been changes on the local level, but literally nothing has changed at the federal level.
That's totally true.
Not a single thing. And Biden has completely walked away from any of the pledges that he made, even his police oversight commission, which is like kind of a
total bullshit.
Stop anyway. He walks away from. And so you can't look at that and not say, okay, there must have been some failures of leadership there.
I want to go back real quick to the question of political violence before we wrap it up, because I brought up two different points, and they are contradictory to some extent. One is the South Africa example, where you did have the good cop and the bad cop. Mandela was serving as the, I'm above the fray, reasonable one who you can deal with. And then you did have people in the streets who were rioting and burning shit down. And so there was violence and there was nonviolence. And that dynamic effectively worked in the long run. But then I also brought up the civil rights example. Now, he was sort of dismissive of the civil rights example, but I have the study right here. I remember covering this. This is in the Harvard Gazette. The name of the researcher is Erica Chenoweth. And she actually originally was militant. and she was in favor of certain forms of violence. And then when she studied it, and it's like over 300 examples of this sort of stuff, and she found that no, actually, nonviolence works a lot better. And the reasoning that she gave, when you look at the civil rights movement, again, just to reiterate it, what happened was you had these people who were very vocal about how peaceful they are and how pacifist they are. And they said, we're anti-violence as a matter of principle. So what that means is it's the turn the other cheek idea. It's the Jesus idea. So, oh, you're going to hit me on this side? Okay, hit me on this side too. Go for it. And what happened was when you had the racist Alabama sheriffs stick the dogs on them and turn the hoses on them and they were getting violent, moderate, regular white Americans turned on the racist white Southerners. And so then when you had this giant sea change of public opinion, at the time, I guess public opinion mattered for something. Now we can have public opinion in one direction. Doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah.
But at the time, it mattered, apparently, and that helped lead to the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, also, you have one of the most racist presidents, Lyndon Johnson, who was the one who signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which is a fascinating, fucking weird thing in history. But anyway, so I myself, my point is, I'm torn on the question of political violence. Because if the South Africa thing worked, then you could argue, well, you needed some violence. You need the Malcolm X to the MLK, right? But if this research is true, then it is also possible in a principled way. As long as you're willing to get your ass beat, then nonviolence could actually work.
Is this the David Shore, the study he shared and got canceled for? Is it that one?
Yes, Erica Chenoweth is the one. The difference is I don't give a fuck about getting canceled. I believe academic research, whether or not people yell at me on Twitter. Go fuck yourself, yell at me on Twitter. I don't give a fuck. People yell at me 24/7. I don't even read it. Who cares?
So I think there's two different questions here, and something that you're always very good at separating out and analyzing. There's the question of principle, like,
right.
Is it morally justified?
Yep.
And David raised some of those examples too, like the penicillin example he talked about, and like, are these tactics in certain instances, like, put aside whether it was a smart tactic or not, was it morally justified to burn that police station to the ground, for example? I would say yes. Frankly, I would say yes. On other examples, maybe it's a little squishier. But so there's like the question of the actual morality of it, and then what you're getting to is this strategic.
Does it empirically work or not?
Does it work?
Yeah.
And I think, you have to answer both of those questions in the affirmative before there's an action taken. And so
what would you say as the answer to those questions? Because that's the whole meat of the conversation.
I just think it really depends. I mean, like I said, in the specific example of the police station being burned to the ground, of this, racist police station that murdered George Floyd, and, the other officers stood by and watched. Yeah, I think that's justified.
I actually wasn't referring to that specific thing. I was on the principle. I was wondering. So, is the violence is okay?
That's what I'm saying. Is it depends.
It always depends. Okay.
You have to the context and all of those things. Yeah, I don't think that there's any easy answer to just be like, yes, it's justified, or no, it's not justified.
Well, just so you know, they abandoned that building because they expected them to burn it. They did that on purpose. The cops were like, let's let them burn this.
Yeah.
Seriously. That's what happened. I know that sounds crazy, but that is literally what happened. But to answer the questions myself, empirically, both of them worked. Apartheid South Africa worked, and it worked to be totally nonviolent and pacifist in the civil rights movement. Both of them worked. So I think you can make a case for either one. But on principle, I'm more comfortable with the nonviolence, and I'm sort of agnostic on the violence. There, I think it really depends what kind of violence you're talking about. Obviously, property violence is way less serious than violence against people.
Right.
And again, everybody knows the only time I'm in favor of violence against people is for imminent self-defense. So anyway, that's my thing on political violence.
Yeah. I'd have to think about individual scenarios, because I just don't think it's that, in my view, it's not quite so cut and dry, because obviously.
Clearly it's not cut and dry.
Yeah.
Even me, who I think in a very cut and dry way, for me, it's not cut and dry. It's very complex and complicated.
Exactly. I mean, going back again to that case that David was talking about with like supplying the penicillin, and now you're saving these soldiers' lives, but then they're killing probably American troops.
Right.
It's,
Or the Chomsky example.
It's very messy.
That Chomsky example, when I heard that, I was like, yeah, it does seem like the moral thing to do. If you have all these things, so you have these drones, let's say, which are going to be used, in the Middle East or wherever, and we know that under Obama it was a 90% civilian death rate. We don't know the civilian death rate under Trump, but we do know he massively increased the number of bombings, and I'm going to guess it's roughly the same, right? I mean, I don't think he's that much. He got rid of whatever guardrails Obama had there. He even got rid of those, so it might even be worse, right? So you see these drones, nobody's going to get hurt. You know what they're going to go be used for. What if you just fucking took them and dumped them in a river or some shit? doesn't that seem like the moral thing to do?
Yeah. Well, and here's what I will
That's
say.
property violence is what that is.
Yeah.
That's
Here's
property violence.
what I will say definitively, which is that I think it's a very common view to give a pass to state violence.
Yes. Oh, you're so right about
and
that.
overwhelmingly judge and condemn, activist violence. And at least those two things should be put and evaluated on an equal playing field.
Yeah, no, the point you just made is brilliant, number one. Number two, it is maddening how bad it is because this, a little while ago, the Ilhan Omar thing happened.
Right.
And remember, she basically said, the United States has done crimes against humanity and unspeakable atrocities, just as Israel has, just as Hamas has, just as the Taliban has. And the whole world rained holy hell on her.
Yeah.
She came out and clarified and was like, no, I'm not saying they're literally exactly the same. I'm just saying and I'm watching the whole thing going, you're fucking right. You're fucking right. Because, listen, again, 90% civilian drone death rate, war in Iraq, which killed a minimum 200,000 innocent civilians, Guantanamo Bay torture, Abu Ghraib torture. This is torture. Now we know as a matter of fact that the overwhelming majority of people who were tortured were innocent. Not even that it would matter if they're guilty, because it's still against the law, against U.S. law and international law. But, yeah, we fucking did it. Yeah, we had the intent. What, did we not have the intent to kill civilians when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Of course we have the fucking intent to kill civilians. So you're killing civilians, and it is for a political or religious reason. The definition of that is terrorism. I'm not making it up. Kyle Klinsky didn't make that up. That's the fucking textbook definition of it. That's what the fuck it is. So yes, when you look at that, you say, of course it's violence, of course it's terrorism, but to your point, everybody pulls up short. Even the good liberals, right? The good liberal Democrats, even some lefties, they go right up to the line. I don't know if that violence is the same because of this old Sam Harris argument of intentions. Our intentions are so wonderful and benign, so it's different. No, it's fucking not different, and I've made this argument before. Yes, manslaughter and murder is different, right? Of course, murder is worse than manslaughter. That's codified into law. But what if somebody leaves their house on Monday, drives their car, they kill somebody with their car? Then on Tuesday, they get in their car, they drive, and they kill 2 more people with their car. Then on Wednesday, they kill 5 more people. Then on Thursday, they kill 10 people with their car. And the entire time they're going, it's manslaughter, I didn't mean to do any of it. It's just happening over and over and over and over and over. Fuck out of here. That's just as bad as murder, if not worse.
Well, also, let's not pretend like our intentions have been amazing.
I'm saying, but my point is, even if you grant that, it still doesn't matter because you keep doing it 1,000 fucking times over.
But there's just such a blind spot, whether it's U.S. government sanctioned violence or police violence
or Israeli violence, Israeli state violence.
Any of that is just
doesn't count.
I mean, you think about even in this conversation that we just had, you and me and Margaret and David talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. We were talking about the justification and is it moral and the tactical considerations of property violence and actual violence among those protesters. But left unsaid was the fact that the police were wildly more violent than the protesters.
To be fair, we didn't mention that because we thought it was so obvious. It didn't bear repeating. But you're right, it should be actually repeated.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway, it was a wonderful conversation. Everybody needs to check out these books. They're great.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this through audio, I don't know what you're doing with your life. You need to go to Substack and pay the $5 a month and get the video. Krystal's wearing a lovely dress today.
Thank you.
Her eyes look great. They're this beautiful honey color. Whatever eye makeup she's wearing is showing the honey color in her eyes.
Thank you, sir.
You don't want to miss this. What are you, silly? Obviously, I'm sexy as fuck.
You also look lovely.
Everybody
today.
knows that. I got a piss yellow shirt on.
It's not. It's buttercup.
Yeah, a little lighter than piss. But anyway,
buttercup.
You want to see this. Of course, you want to see this. And remember, for this podcast, we take $0 from advertisers. And Krystal and I had this conversation when we launched the podcast. And we said to each other, we're only going to make 25% or at most 50% of what we could make. Because a podcast that's our size, top 20 podcasts in the world, advertisers just throw money at your fucking face.
Yeah.
They're like, here, we're just going to give you money for existing. Her and I both said, no, we want to build something better. We want to build something more pure. We want to build something new. And so we're only going to do the small dollar donations, $5 at a time. So anyway, that's my long way of saying, if you support the show, if you like listening to this or viewing this, please do us a favor and pay the $5 on Substack and get the video. And by the way, the real perk is not only do you get the video, you get it a day earlier than the audio. So it's always nice to get it immediately when it comes out.
Yep, you're the first.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, and by the way, I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit jealous about you and Sagar with Breaking Points
Don't
So
be jelly.
they launch
Be
it
jelly.
and like it immediately it's literally #1 podcast like in politics in the world. Immediately leapfrogs all of our metrics for Krystal, Kyle, and friends. Now, yes, okay, we do it once a week. They do it 3 times. Blah 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 blah. I don't give a fuck. Like that, I was jealous. I was like, this is bullshit. And how can they just come out of nowhere on the first day and destroy our shit? And so I was sort of salty at that. So anyway, take the side of Team Kyle and help a brother out and get us up there in the numbers. So that means send this to all your friends, send this to your grandma. I don't even care if your grandma listens. Like, drive to her house and then press play on the shit and then walk out just so we can get the
We
thing
still
that
get the
says
download.
Right, exactly. So anyway, but don't get me wrong, I'm very happy for you and Sagar, and of course,
Sure you are.
I love you guys. No, I am.
Well,
I'm very happy for you, but
To be real, though, for real,
Mhm.
finally, I have been and can actually promote what we're doing here with breaking points and what I'm doing with Sagar. As you guys know, at the Hill, I was prohibited from saying a word about the fact that this podcast even existed. That's a good thing for all of us.
That is
Kyle.
true. You have no idea the seething anger I had inside of me directed at the Hill
I
as a
do-
result of it.
I
No.
have some
You've only
idea.
seen 10% of it. The fact that we started a podcast, and the whole point of the podcast is it's got to be grassroots, it's got to be small dollar, listener funded.
Yeah, and I
then
can't even talk about it.
On day fucking 1, they tell us, by the way, Krystal is not allowed to even mention it to the audience. And by the way, her audience is even bigger than your audience. So that means more than 50% of the people who are going to be a part of this thing are now no longer a part of this thing.
And you're not allowed to come on Rising.
And I'm not allowed to come on Rising anymore. Like, what the fuck are you talking? Are you fucking kidding me? Are you kidding me?
Anyway, those days are over. Happy days are here again.
I'm going to dwell on that shit now, and I'm pissed off again.
You bring up some shit that makes you yourself angry and
Exactly.
upset.
That's a very Kyle
Good work
thing.
on that.
Anyway, all right, guys, we love you, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you guys.